There's this weight some of us carry. Maybe it's a sadness that won't quite leave, but we can't quite touch it. Maybe it's about what happened to you. Perhaps it's a sorrow for the years you believe you've lost just being in survival mode. I'm producer Steve Lessard, and I'd like to welcome you to the Wired for Wellbeing podcast, where we explore how understanding your nervous system can transform the way you live, love, and relate. Today, we're talking about the connection between trauma and grief, and how we can learn to integrate that grief without it consuming us. Each week, I'm joined by my good friend, Dr. Jeffrey Rutstein. Hello, Jeffrey. How are you today, and are you ready to talk about grief?
Hi, Steve. I'm doing well, and yeah, I'm really ready to talk about grief. It is, I think, an often misunderstood or only minimally understood process, and it is absolutely essential if someone is recovering from adversity or trauma to try to make some space for working with their grief.
Now, today I have a voicemail, and before we listen to that voicemail, I just wanted to let our friends know that if you'd like to leave us a question, we have instructions for that in our show notes, and we'll also talk about it at the end of the episode. So, Jeffrey, are you ready to listen to Jesse's question on grief?
Absolutely.
Hi, Steve and Jeffrey. This is Jessie. I was lucky enough to be part of a 9-month program last year, the Healing Trauma Program, and I keep my toe in by listening to this lovely podcast. I would be interested in hearing more about the intersection of trauma and grieving. During the program, I heard a lot of people talk about how much grief was kicked up when they realized how long and how much of their life they had been dysregulated. I'm just thinking that those two are intricately connected, and that, yes, the nervous system work is very essential, as probably is the grieving work as well. So I'd be interested in hearing your read on that.
Jeffrey, maybe you can help us maybe start all on the same page and give us an operational definition of grief.
Sure, that's a great place to start, Steve. So grief is a very strong, often overwhelming response. And it's a response that's both physiological and emotional to the experience of loss, whether that's loss of a beloved through death, a loss of part of your body through illness or amputation, loss of a job, loss of status, loss of a friend group, even divorce or changing where you live can cause us to enter some moments of grief. Grief is totally natural, and we tend to feel deeper grief the more meaningful or attached we are to the person or to whatever it is that's been lost.
So this individual's sharing some information about their experience in the Healing Trauma Program, and seeing how when people get a little bit more understanding of their nervous system, there can be this sense of grief that comes up. Can you help us understand, for maybe individuals who aren't familiar with this work, what that is, and then what's going on there?
So here's another place where we meet up with shame. A lot of times, people who have experienced adversity or trauma growing up automatically assign blame to themselves. I was the problem child. I was too loud. I was too rebellious. I didn't care enough, or I didn't do the things my parents wanted me to. Because children universally blame trauma and adversity on themselves. So many people find themselves late in adult life, 30s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and finding that they still are holding somewhat, not fully consciously, this idea that they were the source or a cause for their harm, for their trauma, for their abuse, for their neglect. And as people heal, especially this is something we address very intentionally in the Healing Trauma Program, is that as people address their losses and the shame that goes along with it, people can begin to see through the shame through the tendency, the reflective tendency to blame themselves, and instead see that their shame in some ways was a lie. I thought that I was the source of this. My nervous system helped me believe that I was the problem, and if I could just figure out how not to be the problem, I could have everything I want in my family. I could have love, acceptance, peace, no violence, no neglect. But that illusion begins to dissolve as we begin to see how we've lived in this trance of shame that's made us feel totally responsible for our pain, our struggle, our suffering, our stuckness in life. And once we begin to see through that, once we begin to see that it wasn't our fault, this is what happened to us, and that because of that, this is how much of our life we lost. Like for some people, they realize they've been dysregulated their whole life, or that they have been working as hard as they can to get others to like them or accept them, and feeling terribly insecure and unsafe about being who they are, about expressing their feelings, their opinions, their beliefs, because they don't want to be rejected, shunned, or pushed away by other people. And so it's very natural as someone progresses along their healing journey, especially with trauma, to begin to review their life with fresh eyes and to see how much of their life they were living this illusion that was all their fault. They've caused all of this, to suddenly seeing that that illusion kept them from seeing the truth. The truth was they weren't bad. They didn't cause this. This is because of the limitations, the woundings of their caretakers, of their parents, or whoever raised them. And as we see that, we can then access the grief instead of the shame and the self-criticism and judgment, which blocks us from grief. We can, with less shame, with less self-blame for our pain, we can actually begin to see the true sources of it, and that it doesn't reflect and never did reflect who or what we actually are.
I've heard you explain that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but grief is something that we humans have a really hard time maybe getting in touch with or acknowledging. Is it mainly rooted in this shame response we're feeling, or is there, I guess, what else might be going on that keeps us from wanting to touch in on it? Aside from, I guess, it
Right.
hurts. It can really hurt to touch in on it. It's scary.
So I'd like to differentiate between acute and chronic grief. So acute grief is always overwhelming. And it's something that we usually can't do much about when it rolls in. It's strong.
So examples like a loved one dies.
Suddenly, unexpectedly, right? Your house burns down in the fires in California, or you suddenly lose sight, or suddenly lose the ability to walk, or you're diagnosed with cancer, or whatever. And all of a sudden, we get in touch with huge, meaningful, big losses, and they just knock us out of the water. And everyone will get knocked out of the water at times by grief. That's just the territory. With chronic grief, it sometimes is not even noticed as grief. It's not even sometimes recognized as grief. Sometimes we just feel flat and we blame it on us. Oh, I don't know why, but I just feel this way. In some ways, for many of us, it's not even being aware of grief. And for trauma survivors, they actually don't even have much sense or access to the grief until they're able to soften the shame enough to begin to see through it, to see how it blinded them, made them responsible for the loss, so that they could never feel or grieve the loss because it was too entwined with their fault.
Can you give us some examples of what that chronic grief might stem from or be or look like for people?
Well, a chronic grief can evolve more into a background sense of life works out for other people, but not for me. Anyone or anything I attach to, I lose. I'm unlucky in love, in finances, in relationships. I'm always losing. That we can begin to identify with it instead of seeing it as a state with information, grief. We see it as some indictment about how we're chronically unhappy. We're chronically kind of wound down and negative and fatalistic about things, but without understanding why and what's driving it. And of course, unmet sorrow, which many, many people have, but particularly if you grow up with adversity or trauma, and you haven't really found a way to meet the sorrow, not get devoured by the sorrow or drowned in the sorrow, but find a way to begin to meet the sorrow, then your sorrow hasn't yet been touched, integrated, healed. And it becomes a wound that feels gaping and opening if we step into it, and then we may work very hard at trying to avoid it. Not understanding that it's grief and we could come out at the other end, feeling almost like it's an abyss that if we drop into, there's no escape.
So let's loop back here, because I want to go back to acute and chronic grief and maybe tie those together, because we were kind of talking about why it might be tough for a nervous system to explore both of those. And you gave us those two examples. And I want to maybe unpack a little bit more about why one, or is there a difference in both of those? And then maybe the addition of trauma into maybe both of those categories. If we've experienced trauma, is there more information there for us about accessing or touching those types of grief?
So with acute, you can't hold back a tidal wave. It's coming in and it's going to carry you away. And that's what grief is. And in many ways, it can be a testament to our love to another person, the deeper the grief we have. But with chronic grief, it may not be recognized as grief. And for some people, it really may not even have enough access to it to even know that there's grief in there. They may just be more aware of feeling ashamed or despairing or alone and empty, but not put it together that this is from some unmet sorrow. Now, with the addition of trauma in one's experiential background, that's going to change both acute and chronic grief. Acute grief will be the same. It's going to come barreling in. If I don't have trauma and I'm in acute grief, I'm going to be dealing with the grief and all that that means to me and all the ways that that comes through, and thinking about the person or imagining a future without them or wanting to reach out to them and not being able to. But if you've had trauma, there will be an additional level, often that touches on some kind of shame or blame. Oh, I should have called them more. I should have really been a better friend while they were alive. If I had known that they were going to pass, I would have done this and that. This feeling that we can't even just be with the grief of the loss, even though it's like a tidal wave, because there's also part of us acting about, did we do something wrong? Were we not kind enough, connected enough, devoted enough, loyal enough, loving enough? And so the grief is then mixed. Even acute grief is mixed with some tinges of guilt or responsibility or disappointment in ourselves, or even stronger forms of shame. With chronic grief, a trauma survivor is even more likely than someone without trauma to identify with the ongoing state of chronic grief and believe that it's them. I'm not a happy person. I'm hard to please. I don't like getting close to people because I don't want to lose them. And of course, no one wants to lose people and no one wants to have grief, right? But there's usually a fear about what'll happen to us. And I think this is almost for anybody about entering grief. It is, in its fullest, most raw form, it strips us away of protection. It rips your armor off of you. You feel kind of like an exposed sack of nerves and raw skin. And it's a very powerful and for some folks, a profound spiritual catalyst, because big grief can absolutely loosen our sense of identity, make us become actually more acutely present to this moment and to how fragile life is. It can bring us to, possibly, another way of being with ourselves in life. That's the more healthy aspects of coming out through grief. The less healthy are sort of never going through it, having it come up, but never really entering into it in a way to work with it. We kind of struggle with it. We drown with it. We get overwhelmed with it. Now, eventually, even in severe grief for people without trauma, that grief will begin to pass. But traumatic loss, even if you don't have a history of trauma, traumatic loss is also a different kind of loss than a non-traumatic loss. Someone who's 103 years old and dies in their sleep is less traumatic and dramatic than an 11-year-old who dies in her sleep, right? So we have, depending upon the context and the situation, different levels of grief. So while most of us can be familiar with it, no one really wants to go into grief. But here's the thing. In chronic grief or in unmet sorrow, we have tremendous power to be able to change the way that we continue looping and stuck in our sadness and grief, or whether we can move it through. And that's the other thing, right? Is that unmet sorrow, unattended sorrow, stays stuck in us. Just like unattended trauma stays stuck in us. And a loss can often be a form of trauma. It can be shocking, shattering our world. And again, amplified if the loss is more traumatic and sudden. I worked with many parents from a 9/11. I ran a group for a little while of parents who had lost children or daughters-in-law or sons-in-law in the World Trade Center collapse. And this group was a grief group, and it was very, very hard work because many of the bodies were never returned, so they couldn't get closure to bury them. It was an agonizing nightmare between life and death. Now, for the folks that also had trauma in their previous life before this happened, it kind of piled on. And this, again, found that place of feeling like, what did I do to have my child killed? What did I do in this universe to have to be selected to be one of these special parents, and that my child is one of these children that was sacrificed that day? So there's anger, but there's also a sense of self-blame or responsibility in this. And that's what complicates grief. So there's also another phrase I want to talk about, which is complicated grief. And complicated grief is when we have a mixture of feelings towards the thing, whether it's a job that we lost or a function or a person. And if we're ambivalent about the person, having positive and negative feelings towards them, our grief is more difficult than if we're unambivalently caring towards them or unambivalently not caring towards them. In those two situations, grief is not as complicated. But it gets very complicated when we have these mixed feelings, and when, especially if relationships went in and out of periods of caring, periods of connection, interspersed with periods of harm or neglect or trauma. And what happens then is there can be a little tidal wave in the beginning of grief in the acute phase, but it becomes very mixed up and muddied because there's feelings of grief and feelings of anger and feelings of responsibility, and also simultaneously a kind of numbness. And all this gets mixed together. So for our folks that have experienced more trauma growing up or have CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which centers around a lot on dysfunction and abuse in early caretaking relationships, that this often sets up people to have a more difficult time with processing grief. And again, if we work through the nervous system, we can help people struggle less with it, at least in the chronic forms. In the acute forms, sometimes what we need to do is be really upset for a period of time, really dysregulated, really sad, really numb. That's all part of the places we go. But it doesn't have to be the place that we live in. And ultimately, it doesn't have to be the way that we always deal with grief.
So let's explore that place that we can live, and, to use your language, maybe how do we meet those unmet sorrows without it continuing to consume us or take us over? What are some nervous system based tools we can use?
Well, first, it's helpful to notice and name how grief feels inside of us. So when we begin to work with a nervous system perspective and incorporate a mindful approach, one of the ways of dealing with strong feelings, grief is one of them, is to pay attention to how the grief shows up in the body. And if we stay with that, the sensations, and paying attention to the sensations, we can actually begin to get more space and tenderness, compassion towards the feelings without needing to shut down, without needing to go into fight or flight to push them away or be enraged that the person has passed or that we've lost something. That's where a lot of complex grief can go. It can get stuck in anger and resentment. So if we can sort of unhook from the story that we're telling ourselves and turn towards instead where we're experiencing the grief, we have a chance to be with it. And recently, 2 weeks ago, my best friend died. And
Sorry to hear that.
thanks. It was not totally unexpected. He had been ill. But even with that knowledge that he was going to pass, the passing was heartbreaking. And then I started going into, I wish I had called him more. I was going to call him the week before he passed, and for some reason I didn't that weekend. And I was going to then put it to the following weekend, and he was gone by the time that next weekend came around. So I started going into some stories about how I disappointed myself and maybe him by not being a better friend. And then going into projecting about future events and him not being there, or going back and going through my Rolodex of memories of him and the things we did and that he won't be doing again, or the things, he was very handy with everything, the things he helped me fix in my house. But because of practice and because of grace, I don't think this is just me alone, but I was able to be with the sensations of grief, locating the heaviness in my heart region, that there was heaviness and an absence at the same time, as if my heart had been scooped out. And as long as I kept paying attention to my feelings, I was sort of being with them. Wasn't trying to stop them. I wasn't trying to fight reality and figure out that he can't be dead or we got to find a way to bring him back. But I wasn't spinning into story, which actually, for most of us, intensifies some of our suffering. So I've been able to hold him very close in my heart. And I've also been able to feel relatively regulated, right? I mean, not perfectly by any means, but I certainly have a bunch of toes in ventral. But I'm probably a little bit more prone to be snappish or reactive, or have a little bit more of a shutdown collapse feeling at times. but I'm not necessarily constantly hijacked by them. I'm not losing my faith or being angry at God or the world or whatever it is, the ways that I might have handled loss in the past. And this feels to me like a gift. Like it's a very painful reality that I'm not ignoring and that I'm being with, but I'm not efforting to move through. I'm not efforting to feel better. I'm not efforting to make this go away. And I'm not efforting to feel worse. I'm just kind of attending to the rise and fall, the waves. And that's another piece. Grief comes in waves. And so it's not that we'll necessarily be steady state about any level of grieving, whether it's about a beloved or our own past, but they will move in and out and often surprise us when they first move in, because we'll be kind of surprised that, wow, I didn't know I still had that intense feeling about this. But again, if you can work towards feeling the sensations of grief, sadness, despair, locating them in the body, and just being aware of them, being with them with your awareness. You don't have to say anything, but it's not like you're fighting them off or tolerating them. It's almost like you think of your grief as a sad, sad child, and you're metaphorically sitting by them, with them, not needing them to talk, just being present, being company, accompanying or being with this energy of sadness and grief and despair. How does that land for you?
I'm just drawn to wanting to give you a virtual hug for your loss, and thank you for sharing that with us, as well as the, I don't know, the integration or the paradox that it seems that you're sitting with. It seems like there's it seems like you're holding multiple truths, that it is sad and it isn't going to fully define you. So yeah, I'm kind of cluing into that paradox. Is that, I don't know, maybe I'm just going to pause and give you a chance to respond to that idea of like sort of holding those seemingly disparate truths.
Right. And they're not really disparate. There's my attachment to him, his import in my life was huge. But I no longer take loss as personal. I no longer take loss as something I contributed to or deserved because I didn't keep being the best friend every day or whatever it is. And by sort of being with the sensations, I'm staying much more aligned with this sense of mutual love and connection we had. And I'm able to feel that still in some ways as strong, even knowing he's no longer here. But it's not just that I'm being with painful or sad feelings, but because I'm not discriminating, because I'm not trying to amplify them or diminish them, just letting them be and alternate, flow as they do, I'm also finding that I'm then open to all these other feelings, and some of them are very nourishing. Like I'm also, even at this early stage, filled with gratitude for his life intersecting with my life. And gratitude that we had the years together that we did. Gratitude that we got to find each other in this friendship and how much it brought to each of our lives. And for me, usually when I'm in grief, it's much harder for me to get to those in the past. I would just be centered on the loss and its implications for my life, and also in some ways how diminished I felt. And by the way, feeling diminished is a very common feeling for most of us with acute grief, and we recover from. But since I spent a lot of my life feeling diminished in a lot of ways because of shame, grief can kind of float into that same pocket of shame. And that's where it can begin to get complex.
let's start to turn the ship back to port here and maybe reconnect with Jesse's inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
I found it interesting in Jesse's question that, and I'm telling a story about Jesse right now, that they witnessed this in others in the program, and they witnessed this not in their experience. And I'm just thinking of whether this is true for Jesse or not. I'm also just thinking about like how scary grief is maybe for people to touch in on. Again, maybe that was Jesse's case or not, and couldn't identify with it, or she was genuinely inquisitive about something she was seeing in the program. But it just brings up this like, it sucks. And I don't want to look at that.
No, you don't want to look at that. Most of us have a natural inclination to turn away, but especially if grief has been in some ways in the past, loss, grief, or sadness, been intertwined in the past with self-blame or shame, then it feels even more dangerous to turn towards it. Because not only will my heart be cracked open by sadness, but then I'm going to fall into this terrible self-hating, self-judging abyss about why I wasn't a good enough friend, a good enough employee, a good enough member of whatever it is that I got kicked out of or lost. And so I think that none of us like sad feelings, but almost all of us hate sadness that's going to lead us to feel horrible about ourselves. Feeling sad doesn't make us feel horrible alone. It's the feeling sad somehow being stitched to our culpability, that we somehow had a hand in making this happen, or we didn't do anything to make it not happen. And that's what I think makes it very, very difficult. And for people working on trauma, it's hard enough to look at the past. And then the thought of, okay, wait, I need to kind of get an understanding of my harm and my grief. Yikes! Who wants to do that? I did also find it interesting. I heard the same thing you did, Steve, about that Jesse was aware that other people are talking about this. And so we can, without her being in the studio with us, we can't ask more questions, but I would be curious to know if it was just more of an intellectual space for her, just a curiosity, which is fine if it was, or if she's kind of wondering, and I know that some of the people I've worked with wondering, you talk about grief and trauma. Do I really got to go to the grief part? Like, I'm looking for the quick route, like, can we cut off a few things and just get me there and healthy and happy without having to touch the grief? And unfortunately, the answer is no, right? If you want to be whole, if you would like to be more integrated, if you would like to be at home in your own nervous system, it means sort of being willing to work towards meeting whatever's coming up with a sense of warm tenderness and curiosity instead of immediate harsh judgment and rejection.
I love Jesse's question, not only for the conversation it sparked and for what it allowed us to unpack, but it's actually a very different type of question than we've received before. And I kind of want to hear your thoughts on that, as well as maybe speaking to people who are a little unsure of like, hey, I've got this question, but I don't know how to ask it, or I don't know what to say, or it's not really a question. It's a thought I've had. So can you maybe help regulate all of our nervous systems around asking questions, and then give us some idea of like where we go and what we do and how we send us a question?
Sure. It's a great. I love this question because it was shared because of curiosity. Jessie was curious about what the relationship is between these two. And even in her question, she said, I'm not quite sure there's a question in here, but I'd like to hear more about this. That's fine for us, right? Because we really want to make this a place where people can begin to interact and get a better, deeper understanding of what's happening inside of them automatically. And then to be able to work with it, to be with it from a friendly place rather than an adversarial place. So you're welcome, and we welcome questions that are anything from a point of curiosity to a very specific question you have about something you notice repeating, or something that you have difficulty changing, and why is that? Or why you may always be getting sad instead of angry, or always shut down instead of being able to be motivated. There's a lot of things, but there's no wrong question.
Yeah, beautiful reminder. Thank you, Jeffrey, that there is no wrong question. So, where can people send their questions?
So you're invited to call our voicemail and leave your question there. And that number is 866 357 5156. Or if for any reason you can't reach that number, you can send an email with an audio recording or just a plain email with your question typed in to hello@drjeffreyrutstein.com. And just to let you know, I have a free gift on my website that goes into a bit more detail about the different states we inhabit and some exercises or practices you can do to help self-regulate. And to get that video, just go to drjeffreyrutstein.com/links. That'll open up a new page and just click on free gift. Steve, it is always a pleasure to do this work, even in the middle of grief.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for sharing your vulnerability with us as well as your wisdom. So thank you for your time, and it's a delight to be here.
It's my pleasure too. And remember, this podcast is for informational purposes only and isn't a substitute for professional physical or mental health care. If you are struggling, please reach out to a qualified healthcare professional. Thank you so much for being with us today. Hope to see you next time. Bye for now.